Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Wolfson College, and welcome to those who will be viewing this online or later on our YouTube channel. I'm delighted this evening to welcome Professor Ulrike Felt to Wolfson to give the annual Haldane lecture, which, as you all know, remembers and celebrates the remarkable father and son, J.S. and J.B.S. Haldane, who lived in the grounds now occupied by Wolfson College. And I might also note that 2024 marks 50 years exactly since we moved to these wonderful buildings and exceptional grounds. Professor Felt is an example of one of those great scientists who breaks the discipline barrier and teaches us as much about social sciences as she does about the traditional sciences. She completed her PhD in theoretical physics in the University of Vienna in 1983. She then worked for 5 years at the European Nuclear Research Centre, CERN, in Geneva, as part of an interdisciplinary research team. After CERN, she accepted a position at the newly established Institute for Philosophy of Science and Science Research. Over time, she continued to work on a wide variety of national and international research projects with a strong focus on biomedicine, life sciences, environment, and physics. In 1999, she became and has remained Professor of Science and Technology Studies at the University of Vienna. She's been a visiting professor in universities across Europe and North America and has been active in a number of societies and journals. She continues to be fascinated, I'm sure she'll tell you about this very soon, by the way the reception of technology can be culture specific. She's worked on ways in which the way we make and take time are relevant to our scientific work. She's looked at how to create the most effective research culture, and she's looked at the interface of science and democracy. So I think we could not ask for a wiser guide to the issues of science and society, and Professor Felt, the lectern is yours.
I'm just trying myself. Perfectly. Thank you. Thank you so much for your generous words of introduction. It is a real honor and pleasure to be here this evening to talk to you about a subject that is close to my academic but also to my personal heart in that sense. Having the privilege to giving a Haldane lecture is particularly meaningful to me because, as you all know, and it has been said already, the Haldanes were already thinking very early in the 20th century about how to position science in an environment that allows us to make things possible and at the same time relate to society in specific ways. Even though this principle, which was very much focused on autonomy, has been reconsidered and adapted over time, it is relevant to reflect it on the backdrop of the questions that I would like to address tonight. As you said already, my own academic journey took me from physics to the social sciences, and it explores and it looks actually into these interfaces between different disciplines, between different fields, between different parts of society, and the way how science works. And I will take you a bit on that trip with me this evening. In my talk, I would therefore like to take you on that journey to explore contemporary relations of science and society, asking the question, which science for which kind of society do we want? This question has a normative and an empirical dimension. The question, it means to not only look at the values and what we think is a good science, but also to look at actually how science works and how it relates in practice to contemporary society, and in which kinds of manifestations does it do so. In saying this, I give away my basic tenet that we cannot understand science in isolation from society, but always look at both what is going on in contemporary science and how that relates to what is going on in parallel in contemporary societies. Both science and society are shaped by their pasts and driven by a specific desire to achieve a particular kind of future. And my subtitle then asks, how can we foster a sustainable relationship between science and society? And the notion of sustainable is really important to me here. So how can we build something that holds over time during also some maybe more difficult situations that we might encounter? So let me begin with a brief diagnosis. Scientific and technological innovations have become in many ways foundational to the future development of contemporary societies. They are seen as instruments of social progress and of personal opportunities. Yet in recent decades, frictions and conflicts over technological and scientific issues have appeared, challenging also our democratic institutions. In what follows, I sometimes use the notion techno-sciences to mean that actually technology and science are inseparable by today. It's very difficult to call something, it's just the science and it's just the technology, because they are both so entangled. So sometimes I will use this notion of techno-science for kind of these reason. And of course, this importance that we give to techno-sciences actually explains why it is so important to think about how they interrelate with society, because they have this shaping power. This sentence you see here has a number of plurals: technosciences, societies, and democracies. While we may think that societies are built on shared values and their governance form can be called democracy, in practice this can mean very, very different things. Societies come with different and deeply culturally rooted histories, have different conceptions of the social and who is included in that social. And even if they share values, the priorities between them may turn out to be quite different. The same is true for democracies. The political theorist Yaron Ezrahi has argued this beautifully in his book on imagined democracies. A democracy, he stresses, like any other political regime, must be imagined and performed by multiple agencies in order to exist. Like a symphony, very nice metaphor, democracy has to be performed reasonably well in order to be realized as a political world. And he goes on to point out that democracy rests on an identifiable number of what he calls necessary fictions. And that is the autonomous subject that can decide freely whatever he wants politically, with rights and duties, the idea of how knowledge and action should go together, a set of shared values, and many more. This explains the plural, so democracies, since we have to be attentive to how each democracy is realized in practice and becomes fundamentally differently. And when I will speak a bit later about COVID, I will point exactly, or about other cases, I point exactly to the fact how we can be so different, why we seem to claim that we share the same kinds of values. So whether it's the COVID pandemic, action on climate change, new genetically modified organisms, or digitalisation and artificial intelligence, they all point to the development of a new relationship between scientific knowledge production and economic and political power. As the demand for expert knowledge increases and science seems to become an ever more prominent societal actor, this very knowledge is simultaneously confronted with growing doubts, strategic ignorance, to use Lindsay McGowan's term, or even open contestation, and we seem to be witnessing a rising distance of science from those who are expected to be governed by this knowledge, as the members of a given society. We can confidently say that we live in a techno-scientific world. Science and technology actually shape the way we understand, order, classify, govern the world, how we participate, decide, and act in the world, how we think about the future and social progress. And in doing so, we have to be aware that science and technology make certain lives more possible for some people and less or not at all possible for others. So technoscience does not only create improvements in this kind of straightforward sense, but also brings new kinds of inequalities into being. However, the more technosciences penetrate into all areas of our lives, the more societies become involved in shaping and in wanting to shape these very sciences and technologies. Indeed, many researchers, including myself, have shown in various constellations how societies try to shape, actually, how research is institutionally embedded and supported, what kinds of questions are considered worth asking in science, and who can participate in this production of knowledge, and finally, society also shape what is valued about science in a wider context. We can see this in the perennial question of impact and relevance, where the UK is particularly fond of doing that, particularly also for basic science. So this relationship between science and society is therefore best captured by the concept of co-production. Indeed, anyone talking about society in the 21st century cannot remain silent about technosciences, and vice versa. We can no longer address issues of technoscience without considering the society this is part of. To paraphrase my colleague Sheila Jasanoff, the ways in which we know and represent the world, and this means both the natural and the social world, but also the ways in which we develop our technologies, are inseparable from the ways in which we choose to live in that world. In this week's journal Science, we find researchers emphatically making a plea for more openly addressing, I quote, the socio-political nature of research and engaging with it if we are to achieve robust, nuanced, and productive communication of science. Contrary to popular belief, science, I quote, is not value-free and impervious to the socio-political context. It is well established that science is, and always has been, influenced by dominant culture and its values. As much as science, actually, I would add, shapes these dominant values and cultures. So it's not a one-sided thing we are looking at here. And the authors are quick to point out that this does not mean that science is flawed or that it cannot generate knowledge that is credible and valuable. And I think this is an important distinction. So it doesn't mean that if I say that science is imbued with cultural values, that this means that it's not science. But the way we choose questions, the way where we put our money, the way what we think is relevant is guided by societal principles. In recent years, in particular, the question of trust, or better to say the lack of this trust, has become a major concern. Antonio Guterres, UN Secretary General, has brought the breadth and complexity of our contemporary situation to the point in his speech to the General Assembly in 2018, offering the following very nice diagnosis. Our world is suffering from a bad case of trust deficit disorder, or TDC, a new disease, he states. People are feeling troubled and insecure. Trust is at a breaking point. Trust in international institutions, trust among states, trust in the rule-based global order. Within countries, people are losing faith in political establishments. Polarization is on the rise and populism is on the march. For science, there are at least two forms of trust we would have to distinguish. On the one hand, trust refers to the expectation that a particular task will be carried out competently. On the other hand, it means that we assume the person to carry out these tasks will do so according to the values this role is attached to, being a scientist. This means that we can easily find people who have no doubts about the scientist's intellectual and technical competence, but who might question the interests and values that guide this particular person. And we have to see, as numerous surveys have pointed out, trust in democratic institutions and trust in science seem to be closely related and kind of related to each other. The two pictures on the slide capture the tension we encountered in many countries during the COVID pandemic. Sorry. During the COVID pandemic, the poster on the left says, you can have your own opinion, but not your own facts. And the one on the right shows the panic that was spread that the state would use science to simply oppress its citizens. That science was seen as, and partly also staged, as the long arm of the state. The famous slogan, "Follow the science," coined by Fridays for the Future movement, was then used as a way out of the dilemma of having to confront denial, strategic ignorance, and the spread of so-called alternative facts. See the Fauci cover of The Economist versus other utterance of how science is already undermined by politics and economic power relation. So you, the science, politics, or follow the science about big pharma. But simply call for following the science is not the way forward. Societal decisions can and probably should never be about simply following the science. Although science should be certainly an important part in the equation when we make these decisions. Be it decisions about climate change, global health issues, or any other complex issue we confront as society. So what was interesting to observe during the pandemic was the increasing call for science, which did not lead to a calming down of the situation. Quite the contrary happened. Frictions between science and society rose considerably. Is that a problem? Here I side with the anthropologist Anna Löwenhaut-Zink, who pointed us to the fact that frictions, rather than seeing them as a problem, could also be framed as an opportunity as an energy-laden moment setting things in motion. And she uses this really beautiful example of the wheel, where she says the wheel has to hit the road in order to make something turn. And in that sense, it needs this resistance, it needs friction. So friction are potentially disrupting, right, the relations between technoscience and society, but also allowing a re-establishment of them in new ways. Simultaneous, she reminds us that frictions are often rather unequal encounters with power relations at work, yet they can also make space for questioning the given orders and for maybe coming out with new arrangements of culture and power. I promised in the beginning of trying to find an answer to the question, which science for which society, and that this question will not remain a purely normative reflection. This is why I will take you to 3 different spaces in which frictions become visible and which press us to think about the relation between technosciences and society in new ways. All 3 are distinct, yet they are closely connected. That's why I picture them as overlapping. They will make us aware, to quote Brian Wynne, that people experience scientific information in terms of social relations, interactions, and interests, with all the affective dimensions that are involved here. And thus, they do not form judgments about scientific knowledge in isolation from other social concerns. Instead, they judge scientific knowledge as an integral part of a social contract that involves mutual expectations and obligations. I will start and go through this kind of how people perceive science and technology in different situations. I will start by looking at innovations and how we deal with them in contemporary societies and how this shapes this relationship. I will then move on and engage with moments of crisis and point to the rearrangements that take place. And finally, I will end by addressing what is often labeled as science, or better to say, research cultures, and ask how this contributes to the way how the relation of science and society is imagined. Today, we live in societies that could reasonably be labeled as innovation societies. While the notion of knowledge societies has been prevalent for quite a while, over the last decade or more, the notion of knowledge has been replaced by innovation, and that's an interesting observation in itself. At least in much of public and political discourse in Europe, but also beyond. And I would like to share some insights from a research I'm currently carrying out on the way how innovations are embedded into societies and the kinds of problems that we encounter here. Looking at discourses around innovation, we witness calls to think out of the box, to do things radically different, to disrupt our habitual ways of thinking, delivering more and different innovations. Slogans such as the right one, innovate or die, nicely convey the double message. On the one hand, it expresses the fierce competition that is omnipresent in the field of innovation. Innovation have to flow to survive in the global economic competition. On the other hand, it also calls for innovation to counteract a whole range of past innovation damages and lead to a socio-ecological transformation that is urgently needed. And so when we thus visit, on the one hand, a fascination, I would say nearly an obsession with the new and the emerging, our attention is focused exactly on the birth of innovations. And that is something that fascinates us. Researchers and their institutions are expected listen to the language, to foster, to accelerate, to incubate. You could put the language as you go. You can look at all universities in order to produce ever more innovations. On the other hand, we expect, quasi in exchange for these wonderful new things, we expect from society to quasi unconditionally be innovation friendly and embrace and integrate these innovations into our lives. This quickly brings us to this question: how innovations are integrated into societies, how members of societies experience these processes of integration, and how does that matter for their relation to the technosciences. Living at a moment in time when the climate crisis is omnipresent in public discourse, I would like to take you a short time travel back to the year 1962 and invite you to look at the way progress was, through technological innovation, was presented to a wider public. Then we could ask how people's experience with such past futures impact the way how technosciences are perceived today. This is a publicity by Humble published in '62 in the Life magazine. It beautifully and forcefully captures past futures and shows what considerations were part of this vision of techno-scientific progress. Each day, Humble supplies enough energy to melt 7 million tons of glacier, says the picture. I leave it to you to wonder the many things this simple publicity tells us about the relation of science, technology, and society 60 years ago. It triggers thinking beyond this publicity about how technoscience developments always come wrapped in these huge promises, with little reflection on the collateral effects or on the left behinds of these innovations, which stay with us for a long time, well beyond the use and the consumption of any of these innovations. In my research, I comparatively investigate 3 fields of innovation, which all have and still are massively shaping our lives, which all came and partly still come with huge promises, silencing the many challenges they also entail. This discrepancy between promise and reality is, so my argument, sometimes tacitly, sometimes explicitly and very strongly shaping the relations people develop with technosciences. While I will not be able to enter each of these cases in any detail, I want to sketch just the three fields to show how that works. The nuclear energy field started with a huge promise: electricity too cheap to meter. And it is also assured the population that science will have solved the problem of radioactive waste when it will occur. Both promises never realized. While having gone through a short period of phasing out and of reconsideration, more recently the nuclear has reformulated its promise in a very new way. We have witnessed a greening of the nuclear, labeling it as a sustainable business and as a solution for CO2 reduction of our steeply rising energy consumption. So we don't question the energy consumption, we question the CO2 output based on that energy consumption. But what about the concerns members of society voice concerning the long-term commitment to care for the nuclear waste, with unclear future forms of responsibility? Nation states like France, for example, are central actors here and give guarantees. For example, environmental surveillance for the next 300 years for the mid and low level waste. Now, none of us knows any state form in the European context that has lasted for 300 years. So what do promises of this kind mean? What does it mean? What kind of responsibility is embedded in such promises? And so I don't even speak about the 100,000s of years that we need for the high-level waste, but even the massive amounts of low and mid-level waste need at least 300 years. And that's something we can at least imagine. That's something, it's a time span that we could talk about. Plastic is my next story. Plastic is the second field of innovation. It was a revolution that came with huge promises. I quote, the possible applications of plastic are almost inexhaustible, Yasli and Cousins wrote in their 1945 book on plastics. Plastic would create a world brighter and clearer than any previously known. Replacing natural materials was the argument. Plastic promises limitless access to cheap goods for everyone. Even the notion of democratization of consumption through plastic was used to highlight the wonderful future plastic is about to create for us. Already in 1972, the first paper appears in the journal Science, pointing to the presence of small plastic particles in the Zaragoza Sea, warning that, and here I quote, increasing production of plastics combined with present waste disposal practices will undoubtedly lead to increases in the concentration of these particles. 3 decades later, we start to think about what we should do about microplastics. 3 decades. Scientists started to account for the irreversible presence of microplastic in our bodies, in our environment, in the food we eat, the water we drink, the air we breathe, with unclear consequences for the planetary health. This raises public concerns and questions the relation of the promises and the unreflected and long ignored collateral innovation damages. Finally, let's come to the now most recent field of innovations, digitalisation. The twin transition is the latest buzzword, at least in the European Union's policy arena. It promises us, embedded in the powerful discourse of the Green Deal, to a win-win situation. That's always the best. Sometimes even they sell us a win-win-win situation. I won't get into the detail. Too much winning is not so good. The green and the digital transition will mutually reinforce and support each other, becoming together, I quote, the cornerstone of delivering a sustainable, fair, and competitive future. Okay. In tone of urgency, there is no time to waste. We are reminded that the need to be competitive and a continuous economic growth is at stake. This discourse also resonates with an already well-established one, that of data being the new oil of the digital economy. It's a bit cynical. This is already leading to a frantic collection and storage of all kinds of data, realizing the dream of big data and artificial intelligence. Data become the new knowing infrastructures about us as persons. We know through our data who we are, if we are healthy or not, and how we live, and if it's good or not, etc. But also about the world around us. But artificial intelligence is also on the way to become the next extractive industry, extracting knowledge from data, without fully admitting the consequences for the environment this will have and already has, and of course also for mankind more broadly speaking. I use the notion therefore of data waste just as a provocative terminology to reflect how we should consider to continue this kind of frenzy of collection over time. Collecting data that are never used, for example, as well as keeping data alive, so accessible, only for all kinds of more or less useful artificial intelligence applications to be able to tap into them, demands huge amounts of resources, from electricity to water, from CO2-intensive materials for data centers like copper, plastic, and aluminium, but also immense quantities of rare earths necessary for all the wonderful devices like mobile phones and iPads I'm using, screens, etc. we are having here. Not only do these materials have to be extracted, creating considerable environmental damages, but they also create new global power relations and fragilities for society not having access to them. Data are not an immaterial good. They are not zeros and ones. They are hugely material. The considerable CO2 footprint of the data industry, which is by now bigger than the flight industry, just by the way, the growing amount of electricity, water, and critical raw materials will become the new battleground where society and technosciences have to meet. It will open up new ethical questions, well beyond the question whether or not an algorithm is discriminatory, has biases, breaches privacy. Even though I underline that these are essential questions for mankind, they are not the only ones that we can pose. So, if we look at innovation trajectories in reverse, when making our innovation choices or when regulating innovations, what would we learn? If we look at what they leave behind, the consequences they create, how would we then look at the innovations themselves? What if engagement with society would be about the collateral realities innovations create, and not only about the next new and the promise that it will improve our lives? We would probably learn about our deep ambivalences, to deal with the unknown, the uncertain, the ambiguous, and our love to not talk about it if we feel uneasy. We would learn about our values on the basis of which we assess the world we want to live in. How much does framing matter for what is regarded when, for whom, as a problem? So who decides for whom what is a problem? And we learn about promises and unclear relations of responsibility. Doing this exercise would also make visible what we need more diverse kinds of expertise to address real-world problems, a point I want to return in a minute. Now let me take you to the second side, so move away and look at science in times of multiple crises. I use the notion multiple crises, and it matters in the way how people respond to any specific crisis. Citizens are confronted actually with a climate crisis, we had a pandemic to deal with, we had an economic crisis, and we could add layers. It's not just one crisis. Members of society, so I could learn in my own research, never analyze a crisis as a single event, but bring in their learnings from other crisis experiments they had in the past, or they observed with others. The pandemic, but also, albeit in very different ways, the climate crisis have become a kind of lens through which the cracks, the fault lines, and the weaknesses of our societies, of our political systems, our established ways of life, and above all, our relationship with science has become very clearly visible. Rarely before have scientists have been so much in demand, so present in the media, and so much under pressure to provide explanations. and quick answers, as in the COVID crisis. There was a clear expectation of science, which had to be nourished in cultural narratives over many years. It was expected to provide timely knowledge about the novel virus, clarify the links between infections, describe the often complex course of the disease, predict the dynamics of the pandemic, and thus create future-oriented knowledge for action. And it was expected to make all this available in a very easy and understandable manner. However, these expectations were faced with a reality that could not be more different. Indeed, the COVID pandemic made the frictions I spoke about in the beginning between science and society extremely clearly visible. It has taught us that unexpected and unprepared governance through technologies created considerable resistance. People were equipped with tracking apps to report their status, received instructions, and were expected to take action based on the information they receive, and many more. Introducing all this in a situation of huge uncertainties and without being able to relate to previous debates on these issues made space for considerable counter-movements and conspiracy theories. What the COVID crisis also taught us was that even if we managed to agree on scientific knowledge, nation-states would still react rather differently. And this is an important takeaway, because this renders visible the importance of negotiation between knowledge and values. It allowed us to learn about rather different techno-political cultures, so how is the scientific and the political working together across the world, about different public reasonings entrenched in these political spaces, about different ways of thinking the relation between knowing scientifically and acting politically, and about different prioritizations of values. Rapid and reliable knowledge was in short supply, especially in the phase of greatest uncertainties, namely the early phase of the pandemic. In some cases, even seemingly certain knowledge had to be revised again and again in relatively short periods of time. Models that delivered predictions were quasi simultaneously confronted with real-world developments that did not agree with these models. Findings produced and conclusions drawn from them were frequently questions even from within the scientific community, and conflicts that would normally be fought out within the community gained public visibility. This question of how we should move from scientific knowledge to political action, or what knowledge we need to legally justify interventions in public life, was raised again and again with a vehemence. Uncertainty and ignorance were more present in public discourse than ever before, and the relationship between science and politics was more controversial than it had been for a long time. At the same time, however, it became clear that no amount of scientific evidence could replace political decision and the social responsibility that goes with that decision. What does evidence-based politics then mean in that context? And even if there is an agreement on the scientific facts, it still remains unclear, I could see, what this little word in between, based, means in evidence-based politics. How this translation from science to social action actually takes place. Nobody spoke about that at any point in time. We were just given some facts and we said, this is the reason for my political action, but there was no translation work being done publicly. So science thus moved to the front stage without being able to control the communication situation. Suddenly it became clear to all of us how science works. It became obvious that the expectations of being able to obtain robust knowledge quickly in response to clearly formulated questions by no means corresponded to the reality that science could deliver. Even though scientific answers, I must say, came sometimes amazingly fast, and that is to all the admiration that I have for the scientific community. We, society as a whole, had to accept that science takes time. that the generation of knowledge often takes detours, that knowledge is fraught with uncertainties, is only valid for limited time and has to be continuously revised, and that there can be, often is, and perhaps even has to be, disagreement within the scientific community, especially in new areas when they are opened up. And gradually a sense of emerged that there is no such thing like the science, but rather a wealth of scientific approaches to a complex problem was needed when working together, maybe opening up possible solutions. This experience is not a problem per se, even though it's sometimes recounted as a problem. But it became one as it did not fit with the usual depiction we love to give from science as delivering knowledge, fast and robust, heavily reliable, everything is under control. Ordinary members of society could not draw on their knowledge about science as a practice, as how it works, about the sometimes messy realities that lead to the generation of knowledge. So what can we learn then? What happened under COVID? Actually, under COVID, the society / the state science relations became more explicitly instrumental. And that is important to say. Therefore, while science was more called upon than ever before, and this was often mentioned in the media as a positive side effect, science also came under severe pressure at the same time, leading to the question of how it can protect its ability to serve society as a resource of critical reflection. Let me move on to the third example I want to give you, the final space addressing the shifting culture of research, specifically in academia. Here I would like to introduce a quote from an article by Bruno Latour in the journal Science from 1998, where he introduces a relevant distinction, I think, between science and research. In the last century, he says, last century and a half, he says, scientific development has been breathtaking, but the understanding of this progress has dramatically changed. It is characterized by the transition from a culture of science to a culture of research. Science is certainty, research is uncertainty. Science is supposed to be cold, straight, detached. Research is warm, involving, risky. Science puts an end to the vagaries of human disputes. Research actually creates controversies. Science produces objectivity by escaping as much as possible from the shackles of ideology, passion, and emotions. Research actually feeds on all of those to render objects of inquiry familiar. So I think it's important when you speak about the culture of science to make this little distinction between, do we speak about research as a practice, as a life, as a way of doing things, or do we speak about science as a canon of knowledge that is being, after control, regarded as kind of settled? It is actually interesting to historically reflect how this idea of science needing to separate from society has been a long struggle when you go back in history. Whether you call it freedom of research or autonomy of science, that has been the guiding idea that is omnipresent in the science policy debates. This has been captured in the often referenced Haldane principle, particularly in the UK context, stressing the decisions on individual research proposals are best taken by researchers themselves through peer review. This involves evaluating the quality, excellence, and likely impact of science and research programs. Prioritization of an individual research council spending within its allocation is not a decision for ministers. I cite the 2010 one. Yet we can ask if everything good when we leave the science to the scientists? Or would we need to rethink the Haldane principle and ask in today's world who would actually be best placed, or what consortium of people would be best placed to make these decisions in relation to science? For sure, scientists can and should make assessments of the quality and the novelty of ideas. That is not a question, even though we also learn that sometimes this does not work so well and has its limits. But where is the wider picture, the question of how societal problems need to be cared for? What are the different kinds of scientific knowledge protections that should be fostered when we consider the societal crises I just mentioned and we are confronted with? And what is the responsibility of governments to put in place institutional settings, and these are not only universities, which serve the knowledge needed to answer actually societal challenges and questions? Taking Latour's distinction between science and research seriously and asking how research as a practice actually changed also delivers insight into how society actually shapes, tacitly, science. Let me give you some examples, and this is really only a short glimpse into it. Perhaps the most fundamental transformation of research in the 20th century was the channeling of a large part of research funding into projects. We can thus speak of a projectification of research. This means that a set of defined project-related principles, rules, techniques, and procedures are introduced, along with specific argumentation regimes, often also asking promises, so what will this have as an impact, for whom, when, and a new understanding of time horizons. A project usually lasts about 3 to 4 years, has a limited budget, and must be able to offer a plan of what will be done in that time. Funding is usually highly competitive and peer-reviewed. Evaluators are asked to judge not only the idea behind the project and the novelty, but also the orchestration of how knowledge, money, and time are brought together in a convincing manner. This has consequences for the kinds of questions that can be asked. They have to somehow be tailored, cut, and squeezed, to use a word of my colleague, to fit into this 3 to 4 years logic. Longer-term questions, many analysts have argued, are therefore much harder to ask. And many of our crisis questions are longer-term questions. This is closely tied to the more fundamental retiming of academic research. Reforms in funding structures, assessment exercises, accountability procedures, curriculum or career paths were all participant in important temporal reordering of academia. The basic driving force was an idea of efficiency that came with acceleration, increased frequency of assessments, project applications, and many more, and a changing rhythm of knowing and living in academia. This has created huge pressures that are often described as creating more mainstream behavior and conformity, and are thus counterproductive to the aims that were envisaged in the beginning when introducing these changes. And as we have seen, and it was already visible in the first space I described, a rising economy of promise of what science can deliver and a complex management of related expectations, the impact talk spread widely. Competition is thus not so much over novelty of insights, but also over the relevance of this knowledge for society, for whatever, innovation. This is, for example, nicely traceable in reporting of some of the more recent Nobel Prizes. I read through the argumentations where the applicability of the knowledge has become an essential part of the narrative. We thus need to see how tacitly the impact of society does also impact how science is valued, and in the end, also how it is evaluated. We have also seen extensive accountability systems put in place, which should assure that the money is spent in the right way, as it's nicely put. However, this has much wider consequences. Accountability structures always run the danger that only what can be counted counts at the end of the day, as a valuable contribution at any given point in time. This in turn impacts reward structures and fosters, for sure, short-term thinking and asking questions which promise immediate return, and it does not necessarily foster the engagement with society which we would so much like. In the end, this leads to the key question posed in one of the Royal Society reports published recently on research cultures. I quote, "Who does research? What research is done, how is it done, and how is it disseminated?" And I think we need to consider these boundary conditions. Let me, with a short example, illustrate how these changes can impact our way to produce knowledge needed for addressing societal concerns, which often says it is interdisciplinary. This is clearly argued in a Nature article from 2020. The author argues that whilst the list of co-authors on the publication and on project proposals might imply the number raises, and implies interdisciplinary collaboration, no knowledge integration occurs, and researchers actually simply end up working on their individual monodisciplinary research separately. This nicely ties to my argument made a minute ago. Successful interdisciplinarity can only come into being within spaces and reward structures for researchers that set actually incentives for people to do that in a proactive manner. So, what we have seen through these three cases is how the relation between science and society has changed over time. Taking a much wider historical view, we can say that knowledge production and technological developments are increasingly over time retreating from everyday lives to specific dedicated places. The laboratory, even you cannot get into centers without badges and controls and etc. So these are not places where people can go and have a look. And on the other hand, we see, along with it, a proliferation of spaces where science and technologies are encountered by members of society. This means that we are confronted with a diversification of the messages, of experiential moments, and of value constellations. All these different encounters can have a very different message about one and the same problem. All this makes the question of the relation of science and society even much more complicated and complex, and for sure hard to answer in an easy and straightforward manner. So let me come to my conclusions. To conclude, I want to return to my initial questions. Which science for which society? More concretely, what kind of science does our society actually need so that we can meet the challenges both locally and globally? But also, what kind of societal environment, what support does science need to live up to our expectations? And how can we foster a sustainable relationship between science and society? Let me briefly explain how I understand sustainability here. It means two things for me. First, meeting one's own scientific needs without compromising the needs of others. That makes, in my account, society. And two, paying attention to the future consequences of technoscientific choices. Thinking in terms of sustainability also demands considering the fact that the space and authority given to science in our society is not unconditional, and therefore should be used wisely. A solid, sustainable relation between technoscience and society thus demands investments in its creation, maintenance, adaptation through learning, and constant repair. Good science communication alone will not do that job. From a societal perspective, it is essential to move away from this dense promissory logic of science and technology, reflecting past promises and learning from them, asking why certain kinds of sometimes strategic ignorance by science and policymaking are so widespread, and acknowledging that people experience knowledge and technologies through social relations, which do often not fall into classical science communication environments. Sustainable knowledge systems, in turn, could best be described as in terms of an ecosystem of knowledge. This points to a balanced coexistence between knowledge that caters to the short term, while deliberately creating space for fostering long-term, more open exploratory research that produces the knowledge for tomorrow's challenges. Diversity needs to be promoted in terms of knowledge, but also in terms of the researchers that can participate in identifying problems and working on solutions. This means bringing society into science. This in turn means developing academia in a direction that makes decent lives in science possible. And we have not done such a good job over the last years in attracting young people into the sciences. The future of science and society relations does not have a script. Sorry, I cannot offer you a playbook that we can follow step by step. But it has to be conceptualized as a learning process in which frictions become a resource. always carefully, critically, collectively scrutinizing the broader picture and not stick with the promises alone. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We've got maybe a few minutes for some questions, if that's all right. And Shivangi, I think you have the microphone. Anyone would like to raise questions? I've got one maybe to start. Oh, you might down here.
Can you hear me if I speak up?
I think it's good for people down the line on YouTube.
Thank you so much for what you presented. It's such an urgent need to address these questions. When you talk about the contextualization, the cultural contextualization of these issues, do you begin to see a systematic difference between the ways that they might be addressed in the majority world compared with how they might play out in the more industrialized kind of society that we're in here in this part of the world?
Yeah, so personally, I have very rarely worked on societies outside the European context, but I have a little experience in Ethiopia and Uganda for some research there. And actually what I find interesting is that we assume that knowledge is everywhere the same, in a sense. And I was struck, for example, that of course we have a lot of animal breeding knowledge, but then scientists were struck by the fact that people didn't like the cows that they were breeding for them, and that this does not respect their kind of cultural imagination, how a beautiful cow looks like. So ownership was something different to just kind of economically own a number of cattle, but also it was a question of pride and cultural attachment to particular forms. So I think what we need to do is actually to invest more time, and I think collaboration across the kind of big borders like the social sciences and the natural sciences is really important to understand these things. So it's not about putting in question the innovation that is brought about by science, but trying to think, where's the limit of applicability of that knowledge in a particular cultural context? And I think this is something we have probably to learn, but even within Europe, it is hugely different. I did a study many years ago on how citizens actually understand biomedical innovations. And we compared organ transplantation as a technology to genetic testing, postnatal genetic testing. Prenatal genetic testing is always a different kind of postnatal genetic testing. It was amazing to see the difference between, we compared Austria, France, and the Netherlands. So we had more countries, but we compared these three ones. And even in the field of transplantation medicine, where you think you have actually regulated it in one way and we have shared values, this is not at all the case. And I was stunned by that, because we have this huge discourse of sharing our values, but they are prioritized differently. For example, in the Dutch context, my right as a person was higher than this was the case in the Austrian case, where the law forbid me to have this kind of more complex donation relations, so triple donations and things like that. In the Netherlands, this was seen as a right to the person who needs an organ. So you prioritize these values. So I think even within the industrialized nations, it is different. And yeah, so it's...
Thank you very much.
Do you think there is a controversy between our elected representatives in parliament, in Western democracies and government who make the decisions over the allocation of funds, and their personal lives and beliefs and education, which are mainly governed by beliefs and very rarely, if at all, by scientific knowledge? And does this controversy lead to wise decisions, or maybe promoting something that is not good for the future of the Western democracy, namely consumption. So all Western governments and societies promote and educate from kindergarten people to consume and increase consumption. Science tells us that that's not good for our future. Yet there is no change.
Yeah, that's a very interesting yet complicated question, because of course you're right in saying that certain sciences underline the fact that we need different patterns of living in contemporary worlds, but at the same time, maybe in the same building, in the same place, you would find scientists who sell their innovations in interesting forms. So there is these contradictions are even within. You know, I have been working a lot with scientists from across the board, and it's fascinating to see how differences are also visible within the sciences. And I would a bit contradict that society is more addressing beliefs and science and not scientific knowledge. It's kind of fascinating how far-reaching a kind of scientific reason has found its way into the way how people think they can argue, etc. So of course you also have total deniers. I'm not saying that this doesn't exist, but I'm always amazed about how people use certain things they have learned, sometimes in not very, in not very clever ways, let me call it like that. I did a very nice study asking people, when the internet became so prominent many years ago already, before they go to the doctor, I asked them to do some research about the condition that the doctor told them that they would have, like diabetes 2 or something like that. And the interesting thing is when I asked them, so you collected this information, how did you do that? Oh, that is good. This is for sure true, she said, or he said, because I found it on 4 web pages. And the interesting thing, he was making an argument. He said, you know, it has been checked and balanced. So he thought that was a kind of knowledge distribution that worked like science works. So if you find 4 people that agree, it will be fine. And it was for me fascinating to see how certain principles of checks and balances, etc., are just wrongly applied to certain things. So it's not that that people do not embrace certain kinds of scientific thinking, but they sometimes just don't know how to word this works or not. So for me, and that I have tried to argue, I think we have to have more debates about these choices, because it's not about science versus values, but we have to bring science and values together in some way. And that can only happen in a conversation. And that can neither happen by delegating it purely to the political scenery, which we all know assures its lives for the next elections. And I mean, this is nothing abnormal. This is a survival strategy. So I would not even, I'm not astonished, let me say like that. So this kind of filters behavior. And so much our interests also on the side of society. But bringing them together creates a quality, I think, where you need to argue why you take a position. And controversies are so interesting, because if I agree with you on something, I don't need to say why I agree, and you don't need to say why you agree. If we disagree, I have to explain why I disagree, and you have to explain why you think differently. So I think this is the kind of message in it, where we can learn something about what is behind certain argumentations by allowing contradictions to be alive and to be lived and not as something threatening, etc. And I think we paid the bill in COVID, I think, of a science communication that was depicting science in a totally irrealistic way, as straightforward, easy, everything is sure, checked and balanced. And no, it isn't. Science is a living organism. It produces, it needs to revise. And suddenly during the pandemic, science didn't work the way they have been told over the last 30 years. That's how science is. And I thought, yeah, it's maybe more prominent, but we should have done a better job in explaining how science actually works and how much time it needs to do things.
Hello, I'm a physicist as well, so pleasure to hear you speak. And you worked at CERN in an early part of your career. So, which science for which society? Should we build a future circular collider for the European and global particle physics community? And as a kind of not unrelated addition to that question, I once had a conversation with a climate lawyer who, in no uncertain terms, told me that every physicist should be working to combat the climate crisis, and that, you know, any other kind of physics was a waste of money.
Yeah, thanks for that question, even though if I would know that, I would earn a lot of money. Okay, more than I do now as a professor. But okay, it's two good questions. The first question is, when you decide about projects, you always balance things against each other. So it's not about either or. And the idea to put everything in the basket of climate change is a dangerous idea, I would say, because, as I tried to argue, we need knowledge that is not driven by problems we have today, but allows us to explore more broadly things which we do not yet know what we need them for. And I give you a very nice example. When I was a physics student, we had lectures on quantum physics. And they had always this touch of, yeah, that's a bit esoteric, you won't ever need that. And I mean, you have to know it, but okay, look at how this is sold nowadays. If you would have said, no, this is kind of esoteric stuff, I mean, why would we invest into research in quantum? We would not have much of the computing stuff we're doing now, much of the kind of... So it's so difficult, and that's actually the challenge, that we need to find the right mixture of more short-term concerns, and there I'm with you, we could invest into kind of tinkering more about how could we solve and contribute to climate change, even though without changing consumption, we can do a lot of science about climate change. I'm sorry to be so disillusional. We also will have to do something as societies. And I think that's the difficult thing. With the CERN machine, that's a really interesting question. When I was at CERN, I came across a report from the 70s, and this was a first. And this report was a collection of examples, what kinds of technologies were developed at CERN that were used totally in different areas. Among them, a tunnel dwelling machine. And I thought, like, a tunnel dwelling machine. Of course, because they need these high precision tunnels, so they can make these circles of 27 kilometers, which come together by half a centimeter or something like that, which is under normal tunnel production not the case. So they developed things that are now used also in other industrial parts, etc. So this is a very interesting melange, CERN, between this kind of basic science and the technological development and the innovation talk. What is fascinating now is actually that's the first time they want a new machine and have no physics that needs the new machine. Yeah. And that's a bit the difficulty. Before, they always had a nice physical theory that they could explain with a new machine, and that was a kind of better story, I would say. Now, this is the big question. And it will be in competition with other projects, I think. And this will be probably what decides. So what are these others, and what do these others promise, etc. So it's never an isolated decision whether or not A or B should be done. Yeah.
I think I will draw it to an end there, because you've given us a lot of your time. Thank you so much indeed. I must say, I'm glad you had the Haldane principle in there. Wolfson is very proud of the Haldane principle. But for me, some of the distinctions you drew between the importance of knowledge turning into the importance of innovation, science as uncertainty or certainty, I think these are really helpful things for us conceptually. So please do join me to say thank you very much indeed, Professor.